Welcome back. President Muhammadu Buhari recently approved the establishment of a Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund, PIDF, which is to be managed by the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, the NSIA. On Thursday last week, the National Economic Council authorized the initial transfer of $650 million to the NSIA from the Nigerian Liquefied Natural Gas Dividend Account as seed funding for PIDF. So joining me now to tell us more about this initiative and is the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, Mr. Uche Orji, who is joining us from our Abuja studio. Thank you for joining us on the show, Mr. Orji.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the NSIA was set up with 3 mandates: to build a savings base for the Nigeria people using the Future Generation Fund, enhancing the development of Nigeria's infrastructure, that's through the Nigeria Infrastructure Fund, and providing stabilization support in times of economic stress, that's under the Stabilization Fund. So explain the rationale behind the $650 million Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund in light of the existence of Nigeria Infrastructure Fund.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very valid question. It's actually not a contradiction in terms. It's not, they're not mutually exclusive. You have to think about it this way. It is an augmentation of capital transfer to the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. Now, the difference between this and any other type of transfer that we have received at the NSIA is that this is now purely designated for infrastructure. The previous transfers that we have received, particularly in this government, where we received $500 million over the last 2 years, have been allocated across the other 3 funds. If you remember, the law says that we have to allocate at the minimum 20% to each of the 3 funds, and then the remaining 40% is at the discretion of the board and the management as to how we allocate it. Now, what has happened to the previous funds, that 20% of the fund had gone to the Stabilization Fund, 40% went to the Future Generations Fund, and 40% went to the Nigeria Infrastructure Fund. This new capital injection, however, is now purely designated for infrastructure. So it is not at the discretion of the board to now allocate it to Stabilization Fund or to Future Generations Fund. That's the only difference. Otherwise, it's going to function the same way every other fund of the NSIA operates. If you want to use another technical name, is NSIA Infrastructure Fund 2, if you want to call it that. But the reason behind this, and perhaps this is probably more relevant to your question, is that there are a few projects that have been designated to be tackled by the Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund. And these projects will now benefit from 3 things: NSI's own investments, NSI's ability to attract third-party investors into these projects, and also NSI's ability to develop these projects and make them commercially viable. And consequently, we believe, based on the plans we have with the government, these projects are going to be completed within the time frame that has been designated because of this fresh impetus of capital injection and even more to come into the Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund.
Yeah, what specific area of infrastructure project are we talking about here? Is it road? Is it the ports? Tell us.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. At the moment, there are 4 projects in the road sector and then 1 in power. The 4 projects in the road sector are obviously the Second Niger Bridge, which we had been involved in previously. Now it's going to be innovated into the Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund with significant capital boost. There's the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, which is an ongoing project as well. There's the East-West Road, and there's Abuja-Kaduna-Zaria-Kano Highway. And then in the power sector is the Mambila Power Plant. These are the 5 projects initially approved by the President to benefit from the Presidential Infrastructure Development Fund. And I believe that and I'm very confident that we'll be successful in executing the mandate of that fund. We'll be able to finish these projects quickly. And the rationale, of course, behind this is that if you look at these 5 projects, the budgetary approval or provision for them was less than 5%. Now, under the PIDF, we believe that we can get to financial close with almost 89% of the funds raised, and then go ahead and then raise another 11% of the funds from third-party investors. So there's a much higher chance of completion of these projects now that there is a clearer financing plan to get these projects through. So those are the five projects at the moment, 4 road projects and 1 big power plant. And Mambila is quite significant because of the scale of the project. It's a hydropower plant with the ability to generate peak power of 3,000 megawatts, which is somewhere close to 50% of what we currently generate in the country within the grid. And so I believe that this is something that will be very transformational for the country. And I might say also, they're all going to be designed to be economically viable. Not at the same scale, of course, but to a large extent, this will be returnable capital. And I think that's a big difference also in the way we're doing this versus the way it's been done in the budget.
So tell me, what are you going to do differently?
But 2 things we're going to do differently. First of all, you're going into this project now with a clear financing plan, okay? As opposed to going into a project with 5% budgetary provision and every year you provide some money and you build some, you stop, and then you go back again the next year, you'll have lost some of the grounds you made in terms of the previous construction. This time around, there's a clear financing plan that will take us to completion. That's number one. So there's a commercial close and there's the financial close. So the financial close element to it is to say we are going in with a plan to get the financing through extra budgetary means. The second element of it is that we are going to bring third-party capital, which I think is going to help, obviously, in getting these things to completion. The structuring of it to make sure that third-party capital is returned, and by that I mean through commercial interests like tolling, as well as other commercial objectives within the road structure and, of course, the power plant, will make sure that these things are designed to be commercially viable and earn a return for the investor. So that's different. The third thing is obviously our ability to bring our project management expertise. We have worked with various parties who will ensure that certificates of completion are executed properly. Now, that's not to cast any aspersions to the contractors, but that means that we will have a direct feedback mechanism as to whether things are going right or wrong and manage these projects properly.